There's a great misunderstanding people have that because it nearly killed him, he must have taken it seriously. The Prime Minister, just like a shopping trolley, smashing from one side of the aisle into the other. I should have been the Mayor of Jaws and kept the beaches open. That's what he said. The Secretary of State for Health should have been fired. Tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die. Helen Morris said, I've come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all, quote, I think we are absolutely fucked.
Political assassination by Parliamentary Select Committee. Dominic Cummings demolishes the Health Secretary and says Boris Johnson is unfit to lead. Will the country believe a man who only came to public prominence after his bizarre Durham trip, the fallout from which he now admits was a major disaster? And how do we respond to his damning confirmation that the care home strategy saw tens of thousands die needlessly?
The government rhetoric was, we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It's complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
Good evening. We often wonder what would happen if those in politics actually spoke their mind. Today we got a full 7 hours of what that sounds like. Dominic Cummings dropped grenade after grenade after grenade on his former boss, the Prime Minister, on Matt Hancock, whom he called a liar, on the devastating and avoidable loss of life in Britain's care homes, and on all the other strategy failings during the pandemic, which he says resulted in tens of thousands more people needlessly dying. This is one man's account, a man who was ousted uncomfortably from his job last November, a man who created enemies as well as loyal devotees, a man who may be driven by conscience or vengeance or by a need to narrate his own place in history. So what to make of it? Does it damage those in power? Does it convincingly explain what happened? Does it, crucially, make us more able to cope with a future catastrophe? We will tackle it all, beginning with our political editor, Nick Watt. And we did think, Nick, that we'd heard it all even before the morning started. What was there in it that actually surprised you?
Well, Emily, I've known Dominic Cummings off and on for the best part of 20 years, and I do have to say I'm not surprised that he's turned on a former boss who declined to accept his advice, because, of course, Dominic Cummings doesn't accept the idea of bosses or patrons. I also have to say that I'm not surprised that he's praising or just simply saying nothing about cabinet ministers who have a great future or cabinet ministers with whom he has an unbreakable bond. I'm thinking of Rishi Sunak and Michael Gove. But this was a hugely significant moment. The second most powerful man in the country at the start of the pandemic told the country today that your Prime Minister and your state failed you at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, Labour clearly think this is a very significant moment. Keir Starmer talked about it, a big issue for him at Prime Minister's Questions. Boris Johnson is saying, look, my focus on all of this is on the upcoming inquiry. Ministers, they're of the view that they hope that this is not going to shift public opinion. They think that Dominic Cummings is very, very unpopular, and they also say that polling suggests that the British people have effectively reached a settled view on the pandemic, which is, yes, it was a dreadful start, but it was a pandemic, and of course the vaccination programme is now going very well. So I watched all 7 hours of that session of that evidence. I should say, Emily, that my report does contain strong language. Always a touch of the lone wolf. Now a loner cast into the political wilderness, but still a formidable political operator with scores to settle. In the dock, charged with abject failings in Dominic Cummings' mind, stood the Prime Minister, the Health Secretary and the British state. A simple judgment about Boris Johnson.
If you took anybody at random from the kind of top 1% competent people in this country and presented them with the situation, they would have behaved differently to how the Prime Minister behaved.
Two charges were laid against the Prime Minister. Firstly, an overly lackadaisical approach at the start of the pandemic.
In February, the Prime Minister regarded this as just a scare story. He described it as the new swine flu.
And charge number 2, in the autumn, a Prime Minister determined to avoid a further lockdown.
There's a great misunderstanding people have that because it nearly killed him, therefore he must have taken it seriously. But in fact, after the first lockdown, his view was he was cross with me and for others into what he regarded as basically pushing him into the first lockdown.
The greatest vitriol was reserved for Matt Hancock, who was accused of lying on multiple occasions over PPE, the NHS's ability to cope, and testing at care homes.
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions, in meeting after meeting in the Cabinet room and publicly.
An emphatic denial of Cummings' claim from the Health Department and short shrift from the man himself.
I've been dealing with getting the vaccination rollout going, especially to over 30s, and saving lives.
And finally, in the dock, the Whitehall machinery, guilty of misunderstanding the severity of the pandemic, guilty of assuming people would not weather a lockdown, and guilty of having no actual plan for a lockdown. But in an irony, it was one of Whitehall's most senior officials who raised the alarm.
I've come through here to the, Helen McNamara said, I've come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all, quote, I think we are absolutely fucked. I think this country's heading for a disaster. I think we're going to kill thousands of people.
And finally, an end to the session.
Dominic Cummings, is the Prime Minister responsible for thousands of deaths? So after a marathon 7-hour session in the House of Commons for Dominic Cummings, he's found a labyrinthine route out of the parliamentary estate and into a taxi.
A Labour MP who interrogated Dominic Cummings was alarmed by what she heard.
I think it's very clear that there are serious questions to answer about the allegations that were made today, both at Boris Johnson but also at Matt Hancock. And I really hope that Matt Hancock comes to the Commons tomorrow to answer some of those very serious concerns. But also, what we saw was a clash of egos, a tale of ministers playing politics at a time when people were losing loved ones, and that is precisely the opposite of what should have been happening.
Tory MPs now have no time for the man they once rallied to defend.
Can I make a dreadful admission? I haven't been bothered to watch any of it, and I rather suspect the rest of the country have been with me. I've got to say the Parliamentary Party don't have much time for Mr Cummings. He gave us a load of grief on his visit to the North East and his famous eye test. And actually, I don't know hardly any MPs who've even been in the same room as Dom Cummings, never mind spoken to him. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's all been a big circus, but life gets back to normal tomorrow. You know, the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health are getting on with getting people vaccinated, getting the country back to normal. And that's what really matters, and I suspect that that's what matters to the people in Batley and Spen as well.
All quiet in Downing Street after a battering from the man who once ruled this roost. But a hope in these walls that such a divisive figure won't ultimately shift the dial.
Nick Watt there. Well, joining us now, the Labour MP Peter Kyle, one of the first to focus on the unfolding tragedy in our care homes, and David Gauke, former Conservative Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor. David, can I start with you? Did you believe what you heard? Did you find Dominic Cummings credible?
Well, I think we always have to be careful with one person's testimony, and no doubt others will have their say. Quite a bit of it, I also have to say, rang true. And so some of the criticisms I think about how the government was very slow to grasp the nature of the situation, that the Prime Minister wasn't as engaged as he should have been, and then subsequently regretted the lockdown. I think a lot of it rings true, but to be fair, you know, it's important that we hear the other side of the argument, and that this information comes out as quickly as possible.
It's weird to hear you saying that. Sorry to interrupt you, but the other side of the argument is still your own government. It's the same party, and it's the two men who were joined at the hip until last year. Do you feel able to defend the government's record based on what you heard today? Would you feel comfortable doing that?
No, not particularly. And you know, to be clear, I'm not a member of the Conservative Party anymore. What I would say is that the circumstances in March of last year were enormously difficult, and all the choices in front of the government were bad, and they were in a very difficult situation. But Also, to be fair, people like Rory Stewart were pointing out that there was a different strategy that could have been pursued. Other countries pursued different strategies as well. So I'm certainly not here to defend the government. I think there were things that they got wrong. In terms of the sort of wider political position, as I think Nick pointed out earlier, the polling suggests that the public are making an assessment on the basis of the performance in 2021 rather than in 2020. But that's not to say that if they made mistakes, we've really got to understand what they were and learn lessons.
Yeah, I should say we invited the government on tonight. They said no. Peter Carl, do you believe what you heard from Dominic Cummings?
I think the overall narrative is a credible picture. It is ego-driven. It is very dysfunctional. There are people who are unsuited, untrained, unqualified in the very, very top of government making decisions that are having a profound impact on people's lives. And I think that is the upshot of what we heard today. And I think that is evidentially correct.
How can you be qualified to deal with a brand new pandemic that is sweeping across the road? I mean, I guess the world, I should say. That is the counter-argument to all this, that it was virtually impossible.
Well, when you look at the countries that have the worst death toll per million people, you're looking at countries that have quite a populist leader at the top, Bolsonaro, Trump when he was running the country. There are people who have trained, who have taken the norms of governing a country incredibly seriously. But we have a disruptive government. Dominic Cummings himself said today that he was not fit to be in that job and thought it was surprising that he was offered the job. He himself advertised for mavericks and misfits, and he brought those people into government to run it in the weeks ahead of a pandemic. So there's no surprise that our government was unfit to run a country in any time, let alone a crisis.
The populist governments, do you think that Boris Johnson was swayed by what he saw from Donald Trump?
No, I think what we have to see is take them at their word at the time. So, if we go right back to February, where we had a delay strategy, the reason why we had a delay strategy in February was so that we could learn from the foreign experience and what was happening elsewhere. We saw in Italy what was happening in Lombardy. At that exact time, we also saw the rampaging of COVID in Spain, where a third of people who were dying in Spain were dying in social care. A quarter of people who were dying in France in social care. If these were the lessons we should have been learning, but we delayed by an incredible 6 weeks, but we did not make any learning from that, because in that exact same period, Boris Johnson was on holiday in Chevening for 10 days. He had missed 5 Cobra meetings. Nobody was at the helm of government. And yet we had these misfits and mavericks inside Number 10 who were clearly fighting like rats in a sack. And nobody was taking responsibility for a credible public health response at the very, very top of government. And
David Gore, your former cabinet colleague Matt Hancock, dragged over the coals, called a liar, incompetent, said he should have been fired 15 times. Do you recognise that description of the Health Secretary?
I have to say that's not my experience of Matt. It strikes me that with Dominic Cummings, you're either brilliant or you're useless, and clearly he's consigned Matt Hancock to the second category. That's not my experience, and I think, to be fair, we need to be able to hear what Matt Hancock has to say. They're very serious accusations. I know Dominic Cummings was asked to provide the evidence to support those accusations, and I think Matt's entitled to have his say and to be judged on that basis rather than just on the accusations. But they're serious accusations.
What was very clear was that apology right at the beginning from Cummings for lives lost, thousands of deaths. Does the Prime Minister have to apologise for those failings we heard today? Does this push him to do the same thing right now?
Well, I think it probably does, and I think it's very difficult for the government to argue that these are matters that should only be looked at in due course after an inquiry. If the conclusion that Dominic Cummings has reached, which I think is almost certainly fair, that there was delay at the beginning of this process. I think there are mitigating factors because it was an extraordinary, unprecedented challenge. I think the weaknesses about what happened in the autumn are also issues of concern. So I think there are a lot of questions for the Prime Minister to answer out of today's testimony. A lot of them we were already aware of, but I think if you like, the pressure on the Prime Minister increases. But as I say, the public, you seem to be giving the government the benefit of the doubt.
Well, let me ask you whether there's also pressure on the Leader of the Opposition, Peter, because it does seem extraordinary how excoriating the former advisor was to the PM. Don't you think that Keir Starmer could have gone harder for all those months, having heard what you heard today?
I think the country wants a reasonable forensic, look at the facts, and that's what Keir tried to do today. I mean, he calmly presented the facts. When you've got Dominic Cummings being hysterical, you've got the Prime Minister who's just shrugging it all off and pretending, not me, Gov. And I think what the country really wants is a leader of the opposition who is just calmly putting the facts to. Now, listen.
You've heard what David Gauke says. The public's moved on and they're just concentrating on the vaccines. That's what we heard in.
Well, actually, look. Today we have had the most senior advisor in Number 10 accusing the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister of lying. We've had the Prime Minister rejecting that, so in effect calling his senior advisor as lying. They're all saying each other as lying. I'm saying quite categorically that none of them were fit to run a public service at which people's lives were at stake. We know for a fact that these things were unfolding. At the beginning of March, care homes, COVID was running rampant in care homes. They say now they didn't know. Matt Hancock, Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson say they didn't know. I stood up in the House of Commons on the 25th of March and I told Boris Johnson on the record in PMQs this was happening. Testing, that PPE and that it was being spread by agency workers. Boris Johnson said it'd be fixed within a week. It wasn't fixed for 8 months.
Peter,
these are the facts and it didn't happen.
You've delivered us to exactly where we're going next. Peter Carr and David Gauke, thank you both very much indeed. Well, there was too much to take in for one day, but perhaps the most chilling phrase we heard was that claim thousands died needlessly. Mr Cummings told the panel that people with COVID were sent back into care homes, that lockdowns came too late, that borders remained too loose, that protective equipment was inadequate, there was no strategy for isolation, no early plan to shut the pubs, and that the PM had treated COVID as a scare story. Much of this is familiar, much we knew or investigated ourselves at the time. But this is the first time it's come from inside the Prime Minister's coterie. What does it feel like to listen to this litany if you lost a loved one to COVID last year? Here's Lewis Goodall.
Where did the mistakes happen? Who made them? What might have been different? These were the questions that were threaded, woven through the Cummings testimony today. A first go at shaping the history that will define these people's careers, these departments' futures, of how we come to think of what just happened, of what is happening now.
I want to clear up the confusions and misunderstandings that I can.
One might say he's an unreliable witness, his Barnard Castle escapade rendering him incredible. But it had the advantage of being the most straightforward and unvarnished account we've seen of how Whitehall and its political and policy players handled the worst crisis since 1940.
The government itself and Number 10 was not operating on a war footing in February on this in any way, shape or form. Lots of key people were literally skiing in the middle of February.
And even when officials began to take the problem more seriously, he says their ultimate political master did not.
The view of various officials inside Number 10 was, if we have the Prime Minister chairing COBRA meetings and he just tells everyone it's swine flu, don't worry about it, I'm going to get Chris Whitty to inject me live on TV with coronavirus so everyone realises it's nothing to be frightened of, that would not help actually serious planning.
This was a theme to which Mr Cummings would repeatedly return, to the idea that the state had to manage itself around a Prime Minister who was more of a hindrance than a help. But he does say that the Prime Minister was, in the early days at least, following advice. He thus provides us with the clearest explanation that we've yet had of the errors and the mistakes that Whitehall was making in the days and weeks leading up to lockdown 1. I.e., he said that Whitehall thought it had time, that the peak wouldn't be for months. They were catastrophically wrong. Then more failures on PPE and care homes, at which he laid much of the blame at the Health Secretary's door and that of his ruinous department.
Now, all the government rhetoric was we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
For many in the social care sector, it was like reliving the trauma of what came before.
It's the bit that's not only surprising but really quite heart-wrenching, because we know of homes where, small homes, 20-bedded homes, who stayed infection-free and then had somebody come in from hospital and lose half the residents. So, you know, out of 20, 10 were infected and lost their lives. And I think that's the reality of what happened because of it.
And do you think he should resign as a result of what we've heard?
Well, I think he needs to consider his position if what we've been told is a fact.
It's going to be one of the best summers we've ever had. Now, if you fellas are concerned about the beaches, you do whatever you have to make them safe. But those beaches will be open for this weekend.
But it was in the second half that the policy failures began to orbit the Prime Minister, with one refrain, a desire to be akin to his hero, the Mayor of Amity, leading, Cummings says, to one policy problem after another.
Fundamentally, there was no proper border policy because the Prime Minister never wanted a proper border policy. His basic argument, at that point, he was back to lockdown was all a terrible mistake, I should have been the Mayor of Jaws.
And so now is the time to take action because there is no alternative.
Here, Cummings suggested that unlike in spring, it was Johnson, not the system, who was fundamentally at fault.
That's why the Prime Minister was so enraged by the situation, because he knew that me and others were looking at him saying, you know, you were told, Catherine Cutt spread out all of this information to you. And that's what we're now looking at. And now you're doing it again. And now the lockdown's going to have to be worse. The destruction is going to be worse. And that means thousands of people have caught it in the intervening 5 weeks who are now going to die. And we're doing the lockdown anyway. And we're going to trash the economy more anyway.
But at the heart of Mr Cummings' evidence, a contradiction. Sometimes it felt like he couldn't quite make up his mind. Sometimes it was all the fault of particular individuals. Yet at other times it was the fault of the dreaded blob, the malaise of the British civil service, the inherent flaws of the British state. And yet at other times those flaws could quite easily be overcome by industrious, eminent individuals, perhaps not entirely unlike Mr Cummings himself. At times then it felt like a rather underdeveloped or slightly incoherent theory of events, a tension which he never quite resolved.
And at one point, it seemed to me he had enormously overstated his case, because he said, look, it's crackers. You've ended up with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, someone that he was arguing was unfit to be Prime Minister. Crackers that you've ended up with me as Dominic Cummings, a senior advisor. Crackers that the whole political system ended up with Jeremy Corbyn versus Boris Johnson. Well, whatever people's politics and whatever they feel about that, he's trying to sweep away the whole of the British political system and say, don't start from here.
At times, as ever for Westminster, this felt insular. Many other European democracies had similar problems. Nonetheless, at its heart was a cascade of the most grave allegations, a system of government overwhelmed, a Potemkin cabinet, mendacity at the highest levels which endures, deaths which need not have happened. His was a partial, perhaps conflicted testimony. It nonetheless leaves much about which the remaining players must make account.
Lewis Goodall there. Well, joining us now is Mike Pagham, who is the Managing Director of St Cecilia's Care Group, and Lucy Easthope, who advises the government on disasters and has done so throughout the pandemic. Mike, can I start with you, because the human element was really the most shocking of all that we heard today. You were right in the middle of that at the time. What was it like to hear it spelled out so clearly?
Good evening, Emily. Well, I wasn't shocked by what Dominic Cummings said today, because I knew that what he'd said had really happened. We didn't have a protective ring around us. We didn't have the PPE. We didn't have testing. And I, in my home, sadly lost 4 people in those very early days. We think from someone being discharged to us without a test in those very early days. So it was heart-rending for the people, the staff and the families.
Did you believe that there was a protective shield, that phrase that was used? Did you think you were being protected? I mean, what happened when the hospital was sort of asking you to take people into the home?
Well, we've done that routinely. Over the years, we've been taking people from hospital to be discharged before they went back home. This was in the early days when we were told actually it shouldn't affect care homes, so the tests weren't available. In fact, we did ask, and we did go and get our own test for the person that became symptomatic. They subsequently were proved positive and went back into hospital and passed away there. Then the virus, we think, came into the home from that route. Of course, we try and trust the government, the people leading us, as to tell us what we should be doing because we follow advice. But sadly, I think many of those things said today are true and things weren't working. Sadly, social care has been not looked at properly in the last decade or more, so we weren't prepared. So all Secretaries of State really have shared a blame for that, I think.
Do you hold Matt Hancock himself responsible, or does it seem ridiculous to try and choose between one senior advisor and one Secretary of State and one Prime Minister?
It's difficult. I don't think you can rule out everything that Dominic Cummings said. Obviously, I wasn't party to any of the discussions. I don't think it'd be all at Matt Hancock's door. What I would say is credit where credit's due. I think the vaccine rollout's been fantastic. But I would just like to say both he and the Prime Minister have not addressed social care properly in the past, and they need to be accountable for delivering proper reform in the future.
Can I ask you, Professor Easthorpe, you advised, you saw all this up close, you worked with government. Was what you heard today accurate? Because Dominic Cummings painted a picture of a system in complete chaos. Was that what you saw?
There were moments today that obviously resonated, and there were certainly very many aspects that were familiar to us at a local planning level and at an advisory level. There were some fundamental things that weren't our experience. One of which was there was a classic mistake, which is, I think, used by outsiders to disaster management, which was a lot of comments were made that plans didn't exist. Plans did exist. And what we've been able to do at local level was innovate those. The other thing that was a sort of common problem that flowed from that was, this assumption that at the very highest level we were in severe trouble. And I think we felt that in emergency response and planning, but we also knew we did have plans and tested processes that we could use. And an example I would give there is he talked about they realised there was no plan for burying the dead. That was absolutely untrue. The plan was originally owned by the Home Office. It's a Home Office work stream. DHSC, Department of Health, had an initial flurry of concern that they didn't have a plan. And then we were able to point out to them that they did. It just had a different logo on it. And he did something today that I think is very common to us as planners. He assumed that because he didn't have them on his desk, local plans didn't exist, when in fact we knew they did. And I think that's really important because I think the public should take some assurance from that, that in the same way as your bins are being emptied, there are emergency planners working behind the scenes all the time.
So should people understand that actually there were great chunks of what he said that weren't accurate?
A lot of it really resonated. It was a very difficult day for us as planners. There were things that he has suggested today as new innovative ideas that certainly somebody like myself and many colleagues have been requesting from the Cabinet Office for years. You know, we ourselves have highlighted concerns with the way the Civil Contingencies Secretariat operate. We've highlighted weaknesses. One thing he really didn't address at all today, but came up very strongly in your own report, is you don't plan for a pandemic in the 8 weeks that you get the notification of a new and novel virus. The pandemic runs through all social care and health planning all the time. And every time you diminish social care, you diminish your ability to respond to a pandemic. And I'd made that point consistently from 2016 onwards. And that's why our death toll is what it was.
Which chimes very much with what Mike has just told us. Can I ask you, Lucy, one other thing? The mantra that we all remember from those early days was follow the science, believe the experts. Was that done in government?
My own personal experience has been, as the situation evolved, they have sought a lot of advice. I've said before, it's got a lot easier for people like me to feed in qualitative advice and concerns on all sides of the picture. It was very, very difficult in the early days to be heard. A lot of what he said there resonated with us as planners today. But what we did at local level was we've been following the science for 20, 30 years. You know, we understand the corona pandemic very well, and we knew how to trust and use local science, and particularly public health. And so for us, yes, we absolutely trusted elements of the science and understood the uncertainties within it.
Mike, I want to pick up on your last point. We've just had the Queen's speech. Social care got, I think, 9 words. Why do you think, a year on from the pandemic, it's still not considered a priority?
Well, I wish I knew that answer to that, Emily. If there were one positive thing that came out of the pandemic, it should have been social care reform happened this year. It's unforgivable that it's been postponed yet again, and that's why I want the government to actually give us a date when they're going to deliver it, or if they don't, step down at that time. It needs to be a priority, and the politicians need to see that.
I mean, you've heard this phrase, this allegation that he didn't care about the over 80s. Now, obviously, we have no proof. We have no categoric proof that was actually said. But do you feel that has been a problem through the pandemic, or do you think actually no, that it was always the elderly that were put first in this?
Sadly, I do think it's been over successive governments of different colours over the years that the elderly have been forgotten. I do think that should be expendable in this pandemic, forgotten. I think social care still is playing second fiddle to the NHS, and that needs to change.
And lastly, to you, Lucy, so there were so many examples given of incompetence. When you were there, when you were dealing, did you think, I'm dealing with incompetent people?
I think local authorities did a fantastic job and the CCGs, but I do think central government was giving us conflicting advice. Every few days it kept changing. And even today, we're still getting different advice, always seems to come out of the bank holiday. And I do think there's incompetence at the top on this issue, certainly.
Briefly to you, Lucy, the same question.
I think, yes, I would absolutely agree with that. It was a new government, limited training. It was all the issues we've been raising before, that ministerially they were not ready for a disaster, but at local level we knew what we had to do. But certainly at central interaction, yes, definitely.
Thank you both very much. Thanks for joining us. The Cummings testimony was compelling to many, convincing, but how much does what we now know inform how we see past errors? Governments around the world were blindsided by the speed and, yes, the novelty of COVID-19. So how many of these mistakes were unique to Boris Johnson or to Britain, and how many were a natural consequence of everything we didn't know, every bit of science we are still struggling to understand? Here's our health correspondent, Deb Cohen.
We've long heard we're following the science. It was at the heart of our pandemic response. And usually, the cornerstone of science is robust, objective evaluation to determine how well interventions we put in place have worked. Today, a different type of analysis in Dominic Cummings' appearance, which will be chewed over for weeks. Let's look at some of what he had to say.
Obviously, in retrospect, we should have had the Taiwan system, right? We should have closed the borders, we should have ramped up testing, we should have had masks compulsory, we should have had compulsory quarantine properly enforced. All of those things should have been happening in January.
By the time anyone was thinking of doing anything, Britain was, Heathrow and the degree of international travel we have just ensures that Britain was going to be in a very different situation.
So you were cautioned against international comparisons.
You just can't confidently make those. Make those comparisons.
But this wasn't the only area where Mr Cummings felt the UK fell short.
We could definitely, without any shadow of a doubt, we should have been able to have tests on the order of 1 million or 2 million or 5 million a day available by the first week of September.
But this is still a contentious issue and the evidence is not necessarily settled. Questions still remain about its effectiveness and any harms such as the impact of wrong results. And experts say the volume of testing in and of itself isn't enough.
Any testing programme, you've got to work out what you do with the test and how you get to the test, how you get the test to the people who are most vulnerable to being infected and passing it on. So although it sounds absolutely great, what they found is that people who were doing vulnerable, poorly paid jobs were less willing to have tests. And of course, those are the people who are most exposed. and who we most need to help to self-isolate. You need to put the support in place to offer the test effectively. It's that way round.
So what about vaccines? We didn't have one for a coronavirus at the start of the pandemic, and no one thought we'd have one by the end of 2020. Those that are available have been trialled, tested and approved at unprecedented speed. But could it have been done any quicker? Say if we'd infected thousands of people with the virus at the beginning, a so-called human challenge trial.
If we'd done that then, we could have hugely cut the time, I think, for doing this. We could definitely have got vaccines in people's arms by September.
Technically, that's possible, but you have to look at the confidence in vaccines. And we've got astonishing take-up of vaccines across pretty much all of population groups. And so the fact that we had gone through a proper process and people were willing to go and have those vaccines early on, that's really important, because in the end, a vaccine is only any good if you can get it into people and they want to take it and they trust the systems that are offering it to them.
The debate about the handling of the pandemic and its real-world impact will rumble on, but it's worth remembering that science and our responses should be judged about what was known at the time.
Any retrospective story is told when you know what the outcome is, and so when you're telling a story which has an absolutely known outcome. I mean, any of the models which are run in any sensible way, if you rerun them, slightly changing the parameters, you get a range of potential outcomes, and particularly for epidemics when so much of what happens depends upon chance events and fluctuations at particular times.
Life may be returning to normal, but this pandemic is not over, and there's still so much science to unpick. We've clearly done badly on certain things, but with so much uncertainty, the lessons may take some time to come.
Deb Cohen there. So after that 7-hour performance that cast reputations and received wisdom to the winds, the question we long to ask is this: will any of it matter to the public's perception, to the formal COVID inquiry, or to the political fortunes of what Boris Johnson does next? Some saw in the framing of that testimony an eye to the next Conservative leader, a desire to revenge destroy those who hastened his fall. Will any of this last? Joining us now, Salma Shah, former advisor to then Conservative Home Secretary Sajid Javid, and Danny Finkelstein, Times Executive Editor and Conservative peer. Salma, let me start with you. We keep on hearing that the public have moved on, and there are many people sitting at home shouting at their screens, actually, we haven't.
I think undoubtedly this is an incredibly uncomfortable moment for Boris Johnson and the government, and there are a lot of people who are going to be angry about the testimony in the same way that they were angry about, at the time, Dominic Cummings breaking the lockdown rules and travelling up north. I think that the best thing for the government to do is have a full and proper inquiry. I think they might have to consider bringing this forward, if practically possible, to address some of these concerns. However, I do think that Dominic Cummings' testimony today is partial, and we'll see, certainly with Matt Hancock coming out tomorrow doing a press conference, what his response is going to be to some of these allegations.
Danny, you're writing tomorrow, if I can put it that way. Everyone should have seen how this ended.
Well, I certainly think that Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings should have appreciated when they got together that their relationship would end like this. Dominic Cummings has done what he's done to Boris Johnson to everybody that he's worked with, and if you were Dominic Cummings and you were thinking, who shall I get in who'd be brilliant at processes and say no to people and set straight all the technicalities of Whitehall, which was Dominic Cummings' big priority, you wouldn't think Boris Johnson was your man, because it's hardly his strong suit. So it was a bit, it was sort of in a kind of tart way, almost funny that Dominic Cummings should be surprised at the Prime Minister he helped to elect, because that was the person he chose to support. And it would be and it would be funny in the same way if Boris Johnson felt extremely hurt that Dominic Cummings has behaved to him as, for example, he behaved to Greg Clark, the person who was asking the questions, or to Ian Duncan Smith, or to MPs in the Vote Leave camp.
Salma, there was that bizarre moment, wasn't there, where he said, you know, the public shouldn't have been given the choice between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. And of course, he was campaigning to get one of them elected. I mean, does that just rebound on his own judgment, that kind of phrase?
I think not only does that rebound on his own judgment, but it sort of suggests that actually he's completely separating himself from the part that he actually played, not only in the 2019 general election, and obviously before that Brexit, which led to the 2019 general election eventually, but also throughout the COVID pandemic. And it's this classic game that he plays where he distances himself. And even though he's very core at the establishment, within the establishment, makes himself appear as this kind of outsider and champion of the little person's rights. And I find that really kind of odd, considering he was the senior advisor. He was, around the table in all these instances.
Danny, Quentin Letts is saying that we watch this for revenge. Do you think anyone is mortally wounded in this round? Do you think Boris Johnson is hurt? Do you think Matt Hancock has to go? Do you think Rishi Sunak is elevated?
It's not a game, is my answer. I think these are very serious allegations, and also, he put forward quite a serious idea of what we did wrong. Personally, I don't buy entirely his idea that there was that idea, for example, that he apologised for his own role. Most of the time, he was apologising that people hadn't listened to him when he made points, and he hadn't early enough persuaded people that he was right when everyone else wasn't. So I didn't buy entirely his attempt. It was very suspicious that all the people he didn't like turned out to be rubbish, and all the people that he thought were great turned out to be great. I found that very suspicious. But his central analysis isn't a game. I mean, it is clear we made very serious mistakes. He gave a pretty convincing account, at least to me, of what those mistakes were, and we're going to have to make sure that we don't do them again. And of course, people will also hold the Prime Minister and others to account for those errors.
Yeah, and Salma, the whole explanation surrounding Barnard Castle got even more complicated today. I mean, do you think that is the fixed impression that the public still has of Dominic Cummings, or will today have changed that, or are they only thinking about the vaccine?
I think in 7 hours of testimony, I mean, even if every front page newspaper dedicates each of their front pages to this for the next few weeks, they're not going to get to this point of this bizarre explanation about why he went up north. It may have been for security reasons. We can't judge that right now. But I think people have moved on, at least for the short term, because of vaccination and because everybody wants to get on with their lives now. Having said that, there are questions that he has raised, and he did make some plausible points about the workings of Whitehall that I think a lot of advisors like myself would recognise in terms of the seriousness and kind of difficulties and conflicts that exist behind the scenes. But I think most people are looking forward to things opening up. And if there is an issue around how that happens because of continuing issues with decision making, I think that is going to be a much bigger problem.
Danny, I mean, it does sound like a terrible place to work. You probably, well, you both obviously know the corridors of Number 10 fairly well. I mean, is it as chaotic as he made it sound, or is that just part of the job?
Look, I don't know about this Number 10. He'll have to comment on that. He can't absent himself from the chaos. If there's chaos in that organisation or the people who are involved in it, it's either caused directly by Dominic Cummings or caused by people that Dominic Cummings did everything in his power to elect. So he can hardly, blame anyone else if he thinks that it's chaos. No, I don't share his view that everybody in Whitehall and in the political system, from the Secretary of State to Health right through to the Department of Health and everybody else in Whitehall is rubbish and can't lead anything. I think that is, I don't accept that analysis, but I do think he raised very serious points. At one point he did say directly he thinks it would have been better if a dictator had been in charge of this, and that is because I think that is what you get to when you think everybody else is useless.
Thank you both very much. Thanks for joining us. Very briefly, just before we go, we'll take you through the front pages. Most of them have got different iterations of that Cummings account. The Daily Telegraph he takes his revenge as he lays blame on Johnson and Hancock. Different quotes going through there, and the whole page is devoted to that. On the Prime Minister, fundamentally, I regard him as unfit for the job. And he says about himself, it's completely crazy, I should be in that position. The Times has Cummings rains fire on Number 10. and the lied repeatedly, unfit. They've pretty much all gone with the same quotes. Given that there were 7 hours, we're still actually seeing pretty much the same. The Mirror has gone for one stark headline, a picture of the Prime Minister instead. Tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to. And The Guardian has gone with that same one as well. Cummings on Hancock, he lied on multiple occasions. And the Daily Mail has Domshell, what they call Cummings' toxic revenge. That is all from us for now, but thank you for watching. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye from all of us here.